Well, the case had been worked over the years by successive detectives that were in the Homicide Bureau, and it had, by the time I got there, just had a pretty refreshed look in 2001 when the DNA was matched between the Northern California rape series known as the East Area Rapist and the Southern California murder series known as the original Night Stalker. So they had gone through and looked at it at that time and done some collating of files, as a lot of stuff had gotten separated over the years, and they'd requested full copies of reports related to the East Area Rapist investigation. And homicide files are kept in homicide, so those were in much better condition than the East Area Rapist files, which had kind of been, unfortunately, spread around a little bit within the department. They were initially investigated by our Sexual Assault Bureau and ended up coming over to homicide as a result of the murders, and there was some other places they went because allied agencies obviously had cases as well. So it was there when I first arrived, but it was not. It needed some organization, and it needed to be checked to make sure that we had everything. The main issue we had was that you don't know what you don't have. So you go through a case and you're not really sure if you've gotten all the documentation. And that was the case with this particular case. I had to do some rounding up of things, and it is a process that took some years because of just the nature of a 40-year plus investigation.
Okay, and that's in 2005. So you got all that stuff, going. Got sort of, I guess, familiarized with the case, I guess would be the best way to say it.
Yeah, I probably had it. Probably started all of this in early 2006. I was finishing up the training process in 2005 and had my plate pretty full with homicides, but I had pulled it, and then not too long after, I want to say, I just started reading it, and there was a lead that came in related to the Maggiore case, and it was a fingerprint. And I was able to research that fingerprint, and it immediately piqued my interest. Obviously, you first get to a case, and all of a sudden there's a fingerprint hit, and there hadn't been one for 20 years. You can imagine I was pretty excited. And then come to find out it was innocently left fingerprint by somebody who we already knew had access to one of the areas that were fingerprinted. So in that respect, it was a lead that just kind of, if you will, got me started, and I was able to resolve it within a couple of days. And then from there, it was I was off to the races. Okay.
And when did you guys first, I guess, officially decide that, the Maggiore murders were connected to the East Area Rapist?
Well, I can't speak for all of the original investigators because there were a lot of people that worked on this case, and Inspector and then Lieutenant Ray Biondi had probably the first initial, investigative portion of it, and there was a lot of detectives working on his team that also were working on it, and they probably had many theories on what they thought or didn't think was involved here. I contacted many of them early on to get their take on the case. In my reading of it, and I close read it a couple times, being able to look back over the entire 40-year investigation as it stood, I had developed some of my own opinions, but I wanted to hear from them. And what I received was somewhat mixed. I got some people who were obviously pretty certain back then that the East Area Rapist was probably the culprit, and there were others that thought now, in hindsight, in retrospect, after clearing out all of the leads that they did work, that that there was clearly a chance the East Area Rapist was responsible, but they weren't as certain back then. And then there was investigators that just didn't know. Very few certainly indicated that they absolutely thought that the East Area Rapist was not involved. But there was, individuals that had varying opinions on whether he was or wasn't, with some very strongly that he was and some not as strong.
And I guess in the 2016 press conference for the 40th anniversary, it seemed like that was the first, anyways, that I knew of that it was officially sort of tied to the East Area Rapist case. Tell us a little bit about that 40th anniversary. What prompted you guys to hold that conference at that time?
Sure, and if I could step back just a little bit, we actually did a program as one of the first that we'd ever been asked to do in the modern era by a show called THS Investigates. And a man by the name of Todd Lindsay had come out and interviewed us about that case and about the East Area Rapist series in general. And I want to say it was 2008, but I'm sure it's easy to research when that program came out on THS Investigates. But in any event, that was, I believe, the first time we publicly linked it in the modern era to the possible series. So if you go back and look at that, there's quite a bit of talk about the links, and that was, I believe, the first time we also publicly acknowledged the finding of shoelaces in the backyard where the murders occurred that were pre-tied.
And so that was a big, MO link, I guess.
Yeah, one of many. One of many. There's the MO links in the Maggiore case are numerous, and that was probably a very strong one, and it was one that many of the officers and detectives that were first on scene had noted, and was definitely of interest to them. To me, it was of interest because just the rarity of a pre-tied shoelace being found anywhere. I mean, there's simply not something you see lying around, especially in the backyard of a murder suspect where the suspect emerges on the other side with a ski mask on. So that was a fairly telling clue to me, and though there had probably been talk in the media, and I know there had been talk about bindings of victims and various things, it seems like the presence of pre-tied shoelaces was just a bit too much to ignore for me. And when I researched the knot that was used, it also was pretty clear that it was the knot that was favored by the offender we know as the East Area Rapist, and he had used it most commonly, and there was a couple dozen or at least 20 events where he had used that very knot. So that was a unique MO trait to me, but there were many others as well.
And, one thing, if you could clarify, and maybe this was before you came on the case, but there's a little confusion about some of the sketches that were released with that incident.
Sure.
I know they came out with one, and then they quickly amended it, and then we saw the one that you guys felt the most confident in at the press conference in 2016. How did you guys settle on that, especially if he was seen in a ski mask? Did multiple witnesses see him, one with the ski mask on and one without? Can you clarify a little bit of that for us?
Yes. One witness saw him with the ski mask, and I believe that was released during the time period, but we will be re-releasing it, and by the time this airs, it may well have already been released. But in any event, there was several sketches done of people who thought that the offender was running through the area, and they had seen individuals that they felt were behaving oddly or in some way had something with them, in one case a handgun that obviously alerted them that this was not a normal person in the neighborhood. So we did get different sketches from people along the route of his egress from that crime scene. There were also some sketches done prior to the crime scene. I should say it was sketches done by an individual who saw a couple subjects prior to the crime scene. And in the subsequent days of the investigation, though it took quite a while, she did identify an individual, a young girl, 11 years old. She identified an individual that was a match for one of the composites that she had done, and then she ended up having looked at about 80 photos before she made that ID. So it wasn't like she was picking the first guy she saw. She was patient and seemed very earnest to find the person she thought it was, and she picked somebody. When detectives went back, they had looked at statements, they had taken statements, and the individual that she selected had made a statement indicating that he was in the area at the time and would have been passing very likely through that area, though he doesn't mention that street specifically. It is on the route that he would have taken to get from his residence, which was at the time on La Loma Drive, north of Folsom Boulevard, to the Cordova Meadows School grounds and what is now Taylor Park on West La Loma. And he is with a second person per the statements we received, and that second person also confirms the story. Neither of these two individuals was very familiar with the street names in the Rancho Cordova area, so when you read the statements, you have to drill down a bit because there's some confusion based on the street names they give, but they wind up at the same destination, which is Cordova Meadows Park, or Cordova Meadows School, and Taylor Park to the west end of the school. And if you look at the streets that they actually say they traveled on, it would have put them in a different place, and the area even that they say they came back to their apartment is that from Cordova Meadows Park. So some of that confusion, I think, is what led to the two-suspect theory, I call it, continuing to kind of be alive. So that lead itself, in my mind, was adequately cleared. You have each subject admitting they were present in the neighborhood, and that particular area would have been the exact area we would expect that they would have traversed. Also, the young girl who saw them reported that they were walking from east to west towards West La Loma, and she saw them at a point about mid-block on La Gloria Drive, and she last saw them essentially at La Gloria Drive and West La Loma, with a slight trip to the north for that. From that location, you would be at Cordova Meadows School and Taylor Park, which is where they said they were heading. Both of those men said that by the time they reached the park, and to give some perspective, the girl said that it was about 3 to 5 minutes prior to when she heard the shots fired that she'd seen these two men. She described them disappearing at the corner, as I said, of West La Loma and La Gloria. But then the men say that when they reached the park is when they first heard shots. And they walked around the perimeter of the park to the north and came back down, met up with Las Casas Drive, and then down back to La Loma, where they said that when they arrived on La Loma, headed to their apartment, they saw the ambulance that had just arrived, which was there very quickly in response to the shootings. So the two suspects being seen together only occurred one time. And those individuals were eliminated, though from their statements it's not clear that all of the individuals that were investigating the case were able to see right away that the explanation for these men being on the street, as described by the 11-year-old, was indeed these two men.
Well, that's really good stuff, Ken. Because I think a lot of people have confusion about that, and I think you really just cleared it up.
I could talk a little more about that, too, in terms of the rest of the suspects. I know you asked specifically about the sketch that was done later.
Oh, yeah, definitely. If you can shed more light on the whole, it's almost like a game of Clue. You're trying to round everybody up that's involved and sort of dissect them of who's where and who can be eliminated and stuff. So, yeah, anything you can add to that. Go ahead.
So, to add to that, the individuals that were in the neighborhood and seen there to the north, when the shots get fired, the first we see of the suspect is he's alone. And so he is in the backyard of a residence on La Gloria Drive. We don't know how Brian and Katie came to be in that yard. And there's many theories about that, but their dog ended up in a swimming pool in that yard. And it was a small dog, a poodle. So when Brian and Katie end up leaving that yard, they're witnessed moving through that yard by a resident who is in an upstairs window, and he gets a pretty good look at least the activity going on. And the subjects are running through the yard, and they end up going through a section of blown down fence. Apparently there have been some storms, and the fence between the backyard of the home on La Gloria and the backyard of the home to the south on La Alegria Drive was traversable just with walking directly over it, because the fence was completely blown down. So the witness from the upstairs sees the subjects, all of them in the yard, the two clearly fleeing to try and get away from the man, and he just describes the man as being a dark figure, a figure in dark clothing. He doesn't indicate whether he has no features of any of these subjects, but he hears the woman screaming. When the first shots are fired, he actually sees the muzzle flashes. The male falls towards the patio area, and he can see this. And then he sees the arm of the offender extended, and it looks like he fires again at the male subject, probably while on the ground. Though from the distance it was difficult for him to see, and again it was dark. He then saw the offender run around the east side of the residence, which was the portion of the residence where there was a locked gate and a fireplace, the outside portion on the house of a fireplace. Katie, we know, was unable to get over the fence in time, and the male subject shot her, and she unfortunately passed away, as did Brian. Both were transported, but neither one of them made it. The male subject is seen for the first time outside that yard, jumping over that fence. And at the time that he goes over the fence, he has a bit of a trouble because he's caught in some bushes. So a witness that is 3 houses away to the west hears the commotion, heard the first shots fired, exits his home, is standing in his driveway, and then hears the next volley of shots, which is the shots we believe killed Katie. And then he hears the subject wrestling around in these bushes. The subject rights himself, and our witness becomes aware of him visually, is a man wearing a ski mask, a dark brown leather coat with possibly jeans or similar kind of pants, and then shoes that don't make noise, is running down the sidewalk to the west, passes the one residence that is next to the yard that he had jumped into, if you will, or jumped out of and then into the front yard area. And then he ends up running up on the common area between the two homes onto the lawn, gets to probably about 20 to 25 feet from the witness, and then he immediately changes direction, runs across the street, and then onto the side yard of a home that's on the south side of La Alegria Drive. That home, or he is seen running along that side yard by the residents across the street, one of whom made a statement in the past, in the crime report, but was unaware of anything other than the suspect ran across the street after seeing the witness. I spoke to another resident within the last few weeks that was on that was in the house, and she said the suspect ran right by the window on the side yard, and she saw his shadow, and then she heard him hit the fence in the backyard. Very consistent with the next witness. So the witness that sees him jump the fence from the yard that I just mentioned sees him emerge onto Capitalis Drive. She sees him running, and he runs right past her and then heads towards the intersection of Capitalis and West La Loma. She describes him as wearing a ski-type coat, a heavier coat with epaulets or some kind of different coloring on the top portion. She thought the color might be green. And then she said that he had a pistol, looked like a revolver to her with wooden handles, in his back pocket. And then he continued running, and he shielded his face from her, and with his arm and jacket, and then ran onto the next street over, and I forget the name of the street, but he continues up towards Las Casas, where he is then seen by other people. And some of the residents see him with an object in his hand that appears to be made of cloth, but about the size of a football. And this is a point of conjecture here, but I think that could have been the handgun wrapped in the ski mask. Because, again, once he emerged out of the yard where he had run off of La Alegria onto Capitales, he no longer has that ski mask on. So my thoughts on that, you probably don't want to be running around a neighborhood with a ski mask on once you've gotten out of the immediate hot zone. So that's speculation on my part, but makes sense that would draw more attention once you're away from the primary crime scene than you would want to do. He continues up, and he ends up on Las Casas, up near where it turns into, I believe it's Las Palos, and he is seen by several subjects there. And one of them, he slows down and he kind of comes out from behind a bush after hiding for a little bit, probably checking his six, so to speak, and looking behind to see if anyone's following him and realizing nobody is. And he's been running for a while, so he's probably got a little bit of need a little breather. And he realizes he's been seen because there's a male and a female, and he immediately rips his jacket up over his face so he can't be seen and makes the comment, "Oh, excuse me, I'm trespassing," which if you follow this case, our offender seems to like phrases like that. He says odd things. I mean, that's an odd thing to say when you are a criminal that's running from a double murder. So that is the last sighting of him, and then he is gone. The descriptions were somewhat different, or similar, but they had differences, some subtle. But the reality is that as long as I've been doing this job as a homicide detective, and I've had no less than probably 200 cases that I've worked in the time period since I've been here, witnesses frequently disagree on details. They're operating from a frame of reference. They're operating from a vantage point that may differ from a different witness. They have different experiences in life, different experiences with what they see and how to describe it. You have to deal with the person who's questioning them may introduce some bias unintentionally. They may ask them a question that leads them to think of something else or answer in a certain way. Things that they say can be misinterpreted. So it really is not something that we typically hang our hat on, these slight differences in description. And in this case, it's no different. The general offender description remains the same. But the most important thing about the description is only one man is seen in the yard shooting Brian and Katie. Only one man is seen coming over the fence after that shooting with a ski mask on. And only one man is seen running through that neighborhood for his life after committing this double murder. There are no two men, and there never was. And that is something that I think hampered this investigation and made this case more difficult to solve, because the two suspects were put out into the media, and rightfully so, because that's the best information they had in the portion of the investigation when you had to do these kind of releases. But unfortunately, it took a long time, many photos shown to the young girl who saw two men together, many interviews to do, and really it was a period of many weeks before they were able to come to the information that, when interpreted holistically, leads you to believe that the two individuals that were seen by the young girl had nothing to do with this. And so one man is seen fleeing that scene, and one and only one man was ever involved, in my opinion.
Oh, that's really good stuff. I think that's going to clear up a lot of stuff for people. One more question, just about the amended sketch of it.
Sure.
So I guess the sketch was amended, I guess, after talking to witnesses and settling on the specific person that most people sort of believed was the guy without the mask on. it seemed like that once that amended sketch came out, it seemed like he sort of skipped town. I mean, what's the feeling within the task force? Do you guys think that is probably a pretty good representation? Do you think that may have scared him away because it looked very accurate?
That I certainly entertain that as a possibility. The origin of that sketch was a woman who had seen the offender, reported what she told or what she had seen to the sheriff's department, but it was about a month later or a little bit more. So I don't believe that the reasoning. I don't think she fully knew what she had seen until seeing some of the coverage, and she believed that she had seen the man based on everything that she was advised. So she had an idea on the description of this man, and then associated the event that she saw with him. She apparently got a clear look at him per her statement as he was moving past her house, and he was unaware of her presence because of where she was standing in her yard. So she got a bit of an unguarded look at him until he was out, realized that she was there, and then of course he started taking some countermeasures. But we think that, or looking at the report, it appears as though they felt that since so few people had gotten a look at this guy's face, that she got the best look. Some of the other sketches were individuals that were seen in the area, but not as directly associated with the crime, because as I said, all the witnesses that were on record, he's covering his face and doing other things. They're only able to make out the most general of features, such as height and weight and that kind of thing. And when they did release that sketch, I want to note that he had not hit Sacramento Sheriff's patrol jurisdiction since the murders. So though he was completely driven out of town, or appears to have left town by mid-April of 1978, he had already left Sacramento Sheriff's Department jurisdiction. His next attack was a Stockton attack following the Maggiore double murder, and then the attack following that and the last for the county at all was in the Pocket area of Sacramento, which is a place he had never hit before and isn't really close at all to sheriff's jurisdiction. So he was already showing different patterns of stalking and attacks at the very night of the attack on the Maggiores. And so to me, I do think the sketch being released may have been a triggering thing, but we don't know which sketch because he's already changing his behavior as a result of the double shooting. And the stakes were high. He may or may not have killed before this event, but this event was a double murder, and that's a very serious thing. So whatever he had done before, though horrific, paled in comparison to this double murder, and he probably was well aware that all the resources that were already coming to catch him, now you can add to that an entire Bureau of Homicide detectives and numerous other officers that support the homicide unit. So I'm sure he realized that the stakes just went higher.
Interesting. And then one last thing before we move on from the Maggiores, can you tell me what the involvement in, the Air Force or military end of the investigation, when they were brought in, and what their role in investigating this case is?
The Air Force police, security police and such on Mather was the unit that Brian worked. And so our detectives spent a lot of time on the base working with them, and certainly the higher-ups in on the base to try to figure out if somebody that might have worked with Brian could have been involved or had information about it. So their initial role with us was mostly cooperation, because the murders took place, though of a service member and his wife, took place off base. And so they didn't have jurisdiction over that crime. The local agency did. They worked with us very closely during that time period, as best as I can tell based on the reports, and it was a cooperative relationship. I know that in recent years, the Air Force's OSI, or I believe that's what it's called, Special Investigation Office, kind of took a look at this case and realized that, it was an unsolved murder of a military person off base, and so they came and offered some support and some additional documents that they didn't know if we did or didn't have. And so we had a couple of meetings with them, and they worked a couple of the angles that had to do with things going on and the base itself. I'd like to talk a little bit too with the the Maggiore murder about some of the incidents and activities going on in the neighborhood right around where they lived on Laverta Court that also increase, in my mind, the probability that these cases are linked. At the time period that Brian and Katie were killed, there had been an absence of activity following the summer of '77 in the Rancho Cordova area. It was, though I think there was still small-scale things going on. There had not been a rape there since, I believe, the 15th rape of the series or around there. And in a couple weeks to a month that led up to the murder, there are documented in the report itself, and I also found other reports in the crime period, or I'm sorry, in the crimes associated with it in that area, several other cases, and including Laverta Court itself. There was a young female that lived there that had been receiving hang-up calls every night for a week prior to the murders. The person would say nothing and then hang up. These calls all occurred at the same time, which was 8 p.m. There has been no calls since the night of the murder to this woman. Then she also didn't get a call the night of the murder. On the in the 2700 block of La Loma Drive, there was a young couple living there, and they'd moved in the fall of '77. At night, they were suffering some significant prowler activity, and they actually had a burglary in the late winter. So it would be just maybe a month or so before the murders in 1977. In that burglary, undergarments that had belonged to the wife had been taken. They also found throughout the entire period around Christmas that the gates and doors of their residence were open, and this whole thing had led them to think someone had been entering their home, but they never found anything missing. We get over to the 2600 block of Capitalis Drive, which is, so far as you can see, these are streets that I've discussed as an area of egress for our suspect. And in that block of Capitalis, there's a young female that resided there and said that she had prowler activity for a steady 2 weeks before the murder and was receiving many phone calls where the caller would say absolutely nothing and then hung up. In the 2700 block of Toro Court, which is a very nearby court, there's a 25-year-old female that experienced extremely heavy prowler problems, and these were going on just a little over a month before the murders and continued up to the point of the murder. She had found shoe prints outside her bedroom window and made police reports about it. Her gate was constantly being left open, and that is a trait. Everything I'm mentioning, people familiar with the case will know were what we would consider EAR activity. And she had this going on all the time in the month prior to these murders. She would try to secure the gate, and the person, whoever it was, would actually damage the gate to gain entry. So you try to fix the gate, and he just goes right through it or damages it in such a way that he can still use it. And then most interestingly, she in the areas where she had found shoe prints under the windows, she also found drawings on one of the windows beneath where she had found footprints. Above where she'd found footprints, and the drawings were in bodily fluids, and I'll leave it at that. I spoke to her and interviewed her myself and confirmed this. In the 2600 block of Sobrante Drive, which is also right there within a couple of blocks of the murder scene, there was a married couple in their early 20s, and they reported that they had suffered a burglary about 4 months before the murder with nothing taken, and they had seen an unusual subject in their backyard more recently. Also in the 2600 block of Sobrante, there was a male in his 20s and a couple of female roommates in their 20s that had heavy prowler activity throughout the summer of '77, and they had had numerous phone calls of a hang-up nature received since that time up to the murder. Going back to the 2600 block of Capitalis Drive again, a married couple in the early 20s reported that beginning a week prior to the murder, hang-up phone calls where the caller would say nothing and disconnect were going on constantly. In the 10,000 block of El Chorlito Drive, a female in her 30s was suffering a nighttime burglary 3 nights before the murder where nothing was taken. She wasn't home at the time, so it's not a cat burglary, but it was yet a nighttime burglary where she had been out and returned, both leaving and coming after dark. Back to the 2500 block of Capitales. I'm sorry, I just read that one. I'm sorry. 2500 block of Capitales, a female in her 20s, suffered another nighttime attempted burglary on the night of the murder. The entry was thwarted to the sliding glass door because she had a secondary security device that kept the door from opening. She also had a lot of prowler activity in the area. And in the most interestingly to me, in the 10100 block of La Gloria Drive, house right across the street from where the suspect and victims initially encountered one another, a female in her late 30s and other females in the home reported numerous suspicious hang-up phone calls in the 1 week prior to the murder. They received all these calls at 8 o'clock at night. The caller would say nothing, just remain on the phone briefly and then disconnect. They got the final call from whomever was making those calls on the night of the murder at 8 o'clock in the evening, just a little over an hour before Brian and Katie were killed. So those events are indicative to me of EAR activity, and those are all going on in the time period immediately preceding those 2 murders. So I think that is something that can't be overlooked. In addition, Katie Maggiore had worked at the Regal gas station on Folsom Boulevard, and she reported a stalker. She had reported that a male in a blue VW Bug would park across the street from her and on Folsom Boulevard and just watch her. He did it for a couple of hours and did it several times, and then one time she finally went to confront him, and she walked across the street, but before she could get all the way across Folsom Boulevard to confront him, he drove off. She goes back to the business, and in a couple of hours he'd returned to the location again and watched her. She quit her job 2 weeks after that stalking event. Her and the coworker also were receiving phone calls from an unknown male at the business, and the person would simply say, "Your turn is coming." A couple of the other workers had received phone calls from another male, unknown if it's this male or not, describing the rapes that had been occurring at other gas stations and asking what they knew about them. It was odd to them, and then of course after Katie was murdered, these things kind of started taking on a different possible meaning. So I think that's pretty much it for the Maggiore case. But it is possible, again, that because Katie had reported that she'd picked up this stalker and it was going on and it did scare her, and that's always opened up a possibility for me that Brian, either she may have recognized the individual because she had seen him and maybe pointed him out to Brian, so he's not even there for Katie on that particular night, but maybe he's in the neighborhood doing something he's not supposed to do, and at about 9 p.m. that was a prowl and peep time for him and maybe a burg time, but not usually a rape time. So maybe he was doing some of those prowl peep type activities, and Katie recognized him or said something to Brian. Hey, Brian, I've been telling you about that guy. There he is. Well, Brian, being everything we heard about him and not just his protectiveness of Katie, but the fact that he was a base policeman, would probably have confronted and tried to at least identify the man for referral or whatever he was going to do. So that is a possibility. It's one of many. I mean, I've entertained several related to how that could have ended up in a confrontation in the backyard of a house that none of the parties involved in the confrontation lived. But that's something that I had considered.
And one other thing I wanted to touch on. Do you know anything about the whole the CB thing that the Maggiores, I guess Katie had told somebody they were going to learn from somebody how to work a CB or whatever?
Yes.
If you can, just tell us a little bit about that whole thing.
Yeah, essentially at the time period, the CB radio craze was pretty pretty prolific, and a lot of people were doing that. And Brian and Katie had apparently become interested in it and had met some of the CBers and had been talking to a couple of them about providing, some instruction and kind of, how to work the radios and how to do that kind of stuff. And it does appear that when this happened, that they were going to be meeting with an individual who was going to help them, and that individual was interviewed, and I'm pretty confident in the initial exclusion they did not feel he was involved in the investigation. And there's other subjects that were kind of involved in that as well that were actually closer friends of theirs that came up over the normal course of the investigation, and then the CB angle was mentioned in their interviews as well.